May 23, 1992, 5:56 p.m., the 829 motorway near Capaci, Sicily. A white Fiat Croma drove along the highway. Inside were 5 people: a judge, his wife, 3 police officers. None of them knew that 500 kilograms of explosives were buried beneath the road directly in their path. A man stood in the hills above, looking down at the highway. His nickname was the Pig. In his hand was a remote control. When the Fiat Croma reached the culvert, he pressed the button. The explosion was so powerful that experts monitoring volcanic tremors from Mount Etna on the other side of the island recorded it. The blast created a crater 10 meters wide and 1.5 meters deep. All 5 people inside the car died instantly. Italy would never be the same. The setup: when the Mafia owned Italy. To understand why the Sicilian Mafia thought they could kill a federal judge on a highway, you need to understand who the Sicilian Mafia really was. By 1992, the Cosa Nostra didn't just control territory. They controlled politicians, they controlled judges, they controlled police, they controlled entire cities. The Mafia had been in Sicily since the 1870s. They had infiltrated the government. They had penetrated the economic system. They had become part of the state itself. A governor had been murdered in 1980. A police chief had been murdered in 1982. A Communist Party leader had been murdered that same year. Each time the Mafia struck. Each time Italy mourned. Each time nothing changed. The Mafia demonstrated they were untouchable. They could kill government officials, they could kill law enforcement, they could kill anyone, and nobody could stop them. The man, Giovanni Falcone. Giovanni Falcone was born in Palermo in 1939. His childhood was surrounded by the Mafia. Growing up in Sicily meant knowing people involved in organized crime, friends, family members, people from the neighborhood. Many of his childhood friends joined the Mafia. Falcone chose a different path. He became a lawyer, then a judge, then a prosecutor. His specialty was organized crime. By the 1980s, Falcone had become the most dangerous person in Italy to the Sicilian Mafia. The trial, the Maxi trial. In 1986, Falcone began what would become the most significant prosecution of organized crime in history. It was called the Maxi trial. For 18 months, Falcone and his team prosecuted members of the Sicilian Mafia. They used testimony from informants who had broken the code of silence. They used evidence that had been carefully gathered over years of investigation. When the trial ended in January 1987, the results were stunning. 338 members of the Sicilian Mafia were convicted. Not hundreds, not dozens, hundreds. Falcone had dealt a devastating blow to the Mafia's power structure. The convictions included major bosses, major moneymakers, men who had run the organization for decades. It was a decapitation of the Mafia's leadership. The problem: the Supreme Court. After the Maxi trial convictions, a question arose. Would the convictions hold up on appeal? It went to Italy's Supreme Court. In 1992, the Supreme Court upheld the convictions. The 338 Mafia members stayed in prison. The victory was permanent. The Sicilian Mafia was devastated. Their top leadership was imprisoned, their power structure was broken, their prestige was damaged. And they knew who was responsible: Giovanni Falcone. The retaliation, the decision to kill.
The boss of the Corleone's clan, a man named Salvatore Riina, decided that Falcone had to die. Riina was the top boss of the Sicilian Mafia. He had to do something to demonstrate that the Mafia would not tolerate this humiliation. He ordered the murder. But Riina wanted it to be more than just an assassination. He wanted it to be a message. He wanted it to be visible. He wanted Italy to understand that the Mafia was still powerful, that they could strike anyone, anywhere. So Riina ordered that Falcone be killed on the highway, in Sicily, in public. A subordinate named Giovanni Brusca, who went by the nickname the Pig, was tasked with executing the plan. Brusca's team identified the highway that Falcone used to drive from Palermo Airport to his home every weekend when he came back from Rome. They planted listening devices to confirm the route. They scouted the location. They identified a culvert under the road where they could place explosives. They purchased 500 kilograms of TNT and ammonium nitrate. They loaded it into a specially constructed container and placed it under the highway. They did test runs. They used flash bulbs to simulate detonations. They built structures and destroyed them in experimental explosions to make sure the bomb was powerful enough. This wasn't a hasty decision. This was meticulous planning. Then they waited for Falcone to drive. The execution, May 23, 1992. On May 23rd, Falcone drove from the airport toward home in his white Fiat Croma. His wife, Francesca Morvillo, was with him. She was also a prosecutor. 3 police officers were in the escort. The convoy approached the culvert at 5:56 p.m. Falcone was driving at 160 kilometers per hour. Giovanni Brusca, watching from the hills above, pressed the button on the remote detonator. The explosion was instantaneous. The entire car was thrown into the air. The blast created a massive crater in the road. All 5 people died instantly. The explosion was so powerful that it was felt kilometers away. It was so loud that it registered on instruments monitoring Mount Etna. The immediate response was outrage. When Italy found out about the bombing, the nation erupted. The Repubblica newspaper attacked the Mafia massacre in its headline. Thousands of people gathered in Palermo for the funerals. The services were broadcast live on national television. Outside the church at the funeral, politicians who attended were jeered and spat upon. Sicilians blamed them for tolerating the Mafia for so long, for letting this happen. The Italian government realized something they hadn't fully grasped before. The public was done. Done with the Mafia, done with the tolerance, done with the impunity. The follow-up, a warning ignored. 2 months after Falcone's death, something happened that should have warned the Mafia about the consequences. Another prosecutor, Paolo Borsellino, Falcone's close friend and colleague, was assassinated. He was killed by a car bomb filled with 90 kilograms of explosives. 5 police officers died with him. The Mafia was executing its revenge on anyone who had worked with Falcone. But in doing so, they made a critical mistake. They killed 2 of the most famous judges in Italy. They demonstrated the Mafia's violence without restraint. And the public reaction was not fear. It was fury. The crackdown. The government finally acts. After the murders of Falcone and Borsellino, the Italian government launched something that had never been attempted before: a systematic, nationwide crackdown on organized crime. Police arrested hundreds of Mafia members. Prosecutors charged them with conspiracy to murder judges. Judges issued warrants for major mafia bosses. Then, in January 1993, something shocking happened. Salvatore Riina, the boss of the Sicilian Mafia, was arrested. The boss of the Sicilian Mafia was in prison. He would eventually die there in 2017.
The trials. Justice delayed, but not denied. Dozens of Mafia members were convicted for their role in Falcone's murder. Some received life sentences. In 2014, 22 years after the bombing, 4 members of the Sicilian Mafia were finally sentenced for their direct involvement in the assassination. They received sentences ranging from 12 years to life imprisonment. Giovanni Brusca, the man who had pressed the button, was eventually convicted. He served his time and was eventually released. The shock. What the Mafia didn't understand. The Sicilian Mafia had expected that killing Falcone would terrify the Italian government, that it would show the government the cost of challenging them. Instead, it did the opposite. The murder united Italy in a way the Mafia couldn't have anticipated. For decades, the Mafia had been part of the Italian political system. They had corrupted politicians. They had influenced elections. They had been tolerated because they had connections everywhere. But Falcone and Borsellino were not just outsiders. They were symbols. Falcone represented the idea that someone from Sicily, someone who grew up surrounded by the Mafia, could choose to fight it instead of join it. Borsellino represented the same thing. These were not outsiders. These were Sicilians. They were from the communities the Mafia controlled. And they had guide fighting organized crime. The Italian public couldn't ignore that. The legacy. A turning point. Historians mark May 23, 1992 as a turning point in the battle against organized crime in Italy. Before that date, the Mafia seemed invincible. They killed governors, police chiefs, judges. The system tolerated them. After that date, everything changed. New anti-mafia laws were passed. Witness protection programs were established. Prosecutorial coordination improved. By the 2000s, the Sicilian Mafia's power had been dramatically reduced. It didn't disappear. Cosa Nostra still exists today. But it was never the same after Falcone's murder. The Mafia had miscalculated. They thought that murdering a judge would demonstrate their power. Instead, it demonstrated their desperation. The lesson: when martyrs are more powerful than living activists. The Sicilian Mafia learned something that organizations throughout history have learned too late. A murdered activist becomes a martyr. A murdered judge becomes a symbol. A murdered person whose face is broadcast on television becomes immortal. Falcone's face appeared in newspapers across the world. His story was told internationally. He became a symbol of resistance to organized crime. Decades after his death, young prosecutors in Sicily cite Falcone and Borsellino as their inspiration. A museum exists at the site of the bombing. Oil from olive trees that grow there is used by Sicilian churches for anointing children. The bomb site has become sacred ground. That's what happens when you kill someone for standing for justice. You create a martyr.
There's something odd about the Falcone assassination that has never been fully explained. Giovanni Brusca and others were convicted of placing and detonating the bomb. Salvatore Riina was convicted of ordering it. But some investigators believe there were hidden orchestrators of the attack, men in high places, connections beyond the Mafia. One surviving bodyguard stated his belief that ignorant people like Toto Riina could not have organized an attack as sophisticated as that. He suggested there were men in suits and ties involved. In 2013, an investigation into possible hidden orchestrator was closed without results. The truth may never be fully known. What is known is that Falcone and Borsellino are dead, and the nation they tried to save is better because of their sacrifice. The final lesson: the power of individual courage. Giovanni Falcone didn't have the resources of a military. He didn't have the power of a government behind him initially. He had courage. He had conviction. He had a belief that the law could defeat organized crime. He built a case that resulted in the conviction of 338 mobsters. For that, he died. But his death changed Italy. It changed how the country approached organized crime. It changed the public's willingness to tolerate the mafia. It changed the government's commitment to prosecution. One man, one prosecutor, one judge was willing to stand against an entire criminal empire, and he changed the course of history because of that.
June 21, 1991, Long Island, Cedarhurst. Victor Marina pulled into his driveway around 7 p.m. He had no idea that a hit team was waiting for him in the shadows. As Arena stepped out of his car, gunmen emerged from the darkness with weapons drawn. They fired at him. Multiple shots, a full execution attempt. But Arena saw them coming. He ran. The bullets missed him. In that moment, the Colombo family tore itself apart. For the next 22 months, members of the same family murdered each other. Brothers killed cousins. Best friends shot each other. Entire crews were decimated. By the time the violence ended, the family had collapsed, and nobody actually won. The setup, the prison boss problem. To understand the Colombo War, you need to understand how a family could self-destruct so completely. In 1986, Carmine, the snake, Persico, was the boss of the Colombo family. But Persico had a problem. He was in prison, not for a month or a year, for good. He was sentenced to 100 years in prison with no possibility of parole. For most crime families, a boss in prison meant the end of that boss's power. But Persico refused to step down. He continued giving orders from inside prison. He continued running the family. He continued making decisions. To do this, he appointed an acting boss. First, his own brother, Alfonso Little Alley Boy Persico, took the job. Then, Little Alley Boy got arrested for loan sharking and served some time. So, Persico created a ruling committee consisting of 3 men, Victor Arena, Joseph Russo, and Benedetto Alloy. The committee was supposed to run the family until Little Alley Boy got out of prison. The problem, when the acting boss got ideas. By 1988, Victor Arena had been named sole acting boss. Arena was supposed to be temporary, just holding the position until Little Alley Boy finished serving his sentence. But something happened that almost nobody expected. Arena started making money. His crew on Long Island became a money-making machine. They were doing incredible business: extortion, gambling, loan sharking, everything profitable. Millions of dollars flowed into the family coffers because of Arena's crew. And the more successful he became, the more Arena started asking himself a simple question: why should I give this up? Why should he hand over power to Little Alley Boy? Why should Persico's son get the position just because of blood? Arena had earned it. His crew was producing. His men respected him. More importantly, Arena had powerful allies. He had the backing of John Gotti of the Gambino family.
Gotti liked Arena. Gotti supported him. With Gotti's backing, Arena believed he could take control permanently. The petition, when the Arena challenged Persico. In 1990, Arena did something dangerous. He went to the commission, the board of directors of organized crime. He petitioned the commission to recognize him as the legitimate boss of the Colombo family instead of Persico. His argument was simple. Persico is in prison for life. He can't run a family from a cell. I'm running the family now. I should be officially recognized. The commission heard him out, but they refused his request. The commission didn't want to destabilize the Colombo family. A succession dispute between Persico and Arena could tear the family apart. So the commission said no. Persico was the boss. Arena could keep acting as street boss, but the ultimate authority remained Persico in prison. Arena was angry, but he accepted the decision. Or so it seemed.
The breaking point, the betrayal. Arena decided to take matters into his own hands. He instructed his consigliere, Carmine Sessa, to poll the captains of the family, to ask them, would you support Arena as boss instead of Persico? Sessa began the polling, but Sessa made a critical mistake. He wasn't loyal to Arena. Instead of just polling, Sessa reported everything back to Persico. Persico learned that Arena was staging a coup, that Arena was trying to convince the captains to abandon Persico and support Arena instead. Persico was outraged. He ordered Sessa to arrange a hit on Arena. The goal? Kill Arena and eliminate the threat to Persico's authority. The attempt, June 21, 1991. Carmine Sessa sent a hit team to Arena's home in Cedarhurst, Long Island. They waited in the shadows, loaded weapons, ready to kill. When Arena arrived home on June 21, they opened fire, but Arena saw them coming. He dove back into his car and crashed through the gates of his driveway, escaping into the night. The hit team had failed. Arena survived. The war, 22 months of family destruction. Once Arena escaped the hit attempt, something changed inside him. He realized that Persico would never stop trying to kill him. So Arena decided to go all in. He gathered his supporters and declared war on the Persico faction. What followed was the most brutal internal mafia conflict since the original mob wars of the 1920s. The Colombo family split into two factions. The Persico faction, supporting Carmine Persico and his son, Little Ally Boy. The Arena faction, supporting Victor Arena. But unlike a normal mafia war where two separate organizations fight, this was brothers fighting brothers, cousins fighting cousins, crew members who had worked together for decades suddenly killing each other. The violence was constant. Street corners erupted in gunfire. Clubhouses were raided. Soldiers were ambushed leaving restaurants. Murders happened daily. By the end of the war, at least 12 significant members of the Colombo family had been murdered. Some sources put the number higher, around 20, 30 total deaths when you count soldiers and associates. The violence wasn't strategic, it was personal, it was brutal. The casualties, a family cannibalized. Gregory Scarpa Sr., one of the most feared mobsters in New York history, was attacked during the war. Scarpa was Arena's supporter. On November 18, 1991, 2 carloads of Persico supporters ambushed him as he drove. Scarpa, in his 60s and slowing down, managed to escape by hitting the accelerator and crashing through the ambush. But he was wounded and traumatized. He knew he was marked for death. Other major figures were killed. John Scopo, an underboss, was murdered. He was shot by an 18-year-old assassin named John Papa, who was dispatched by Greg Scarpa on behalf of the Persico faction. After the Scopo hit, Papa even murdered his two partners in the killing for trying to take credit for the assassination. That's how brutal this war was. People were murdering each other over credit for murders. Papa is now serving 4 consecutive life sentences. The violence touched everyone. Soldiers disappeared. Capos were killed in their cars. Business operations were disrupted. The Colombo family, which had once been one of the 5 families controlling New York, was being systematically destroyed from the inside.
The winner, who actually prevailed. By early 1993, after 22 months of violence, the Persico faction had technically won. They had killed enough of Arena's supporters that Arena's faction was no longer a viable force. Arena himself eventually ended up back in prison for other crimes. But it was a hollow victory. The family had been gutted. Hundreds of soldiers and associates had been arrested due to the increased law enforcement attention the war brought. The family lost its seat on the commission. They were kicked off the board of directors of organized crime for the duration of the war. Business operations had stopped. Money wasn't being made. Territory was being abandoned. By defeating Arena, the Persico faction defeated themselves. The Colombo family never fully recovered from the war. The cost, what was lost? The numbers tell the story. At least 12 significant deaths during the war, though some accounts say over 30 total deaths when including soldiers and associates. Hundreds of arrests and federal prosecutions resulting from increased law enforcement attention the war brought. The family lost its seat on the commission. They were kicked off the board of directors of organized crime for the duration of the war. Business operations had stopped. Money wasn't being made. Territory was being abandoned. By defeating Arena, the Persico faction defeated themselves. The Colombo family never fully recovered from the war. The irony, the Persico victory, that was a defeat. The Persico faction won the war militarily, but they lost strategically. Carmine Persico remained in prison for life, still giving orders from behind bars. His son, Little Alley Boy, eventually took over, but the family he inherited was a shadow of what it had been. Meanwhile, other New York crime families flourished. The Gambino family, led by John Gotti, dominated. The Genovese family maintained power. The Lucchese family and Bonanno families adapted. But the Colombo family was crippled. It was as if Persico had ordered a victory that destroyed the very thing he was trying to preserve. The question, why didn't Persico just let Arena take over? Persico is imprisoned for life. He would never see freedom. He would never enjoy the benefits of being a mob boss. If he had allowed Arena to become the official boss, the family would have continued functioning smoothly. Persico's family would have remained in power through Arena's loyalty. Instead, Persico chose to fight, to maintain his authority from behind prison bars, to order murders to preserve his position. And in doing so, he destroyed the family he was trying to preserve. It was ego, pure ego. Persico couldn't stand the idea that someone would challenge his authority, even though he could never use that authority ever again. Even though letting Arena lead might have been better for everyone. Persico chose power over pragmatism, and the Colombo family paid the price.
The aftermath, a family in decline. After the war ended, the Colombo family was officially allowed back onto the commission in 1993, but they were damaged goods. Their earning power was reduced, their membership was depleted, their reputation was tarnished. The family would continue to exist, but it would never regain its position as one of the equal partners in the 5 families. By the 2000s, the Colombo family was considered one of the weakest of the 5 families, a dramatic decline from their historical prominence. The Civil War had accomplished what federal prosecutors couldn't. the systematic dismantling of a major crime family. The lesson: when internal conflict destroys more than external enemies. The Colombo War teaches a harsh lesson. An organization's greatest enemy isn't always external. It's sometimes internal. The Colombo family didn't fall to law enforcement pressure. They felt that their own leadership's refusal to adapt. A family member took over because their boss was incapacitated. That family member wanted to keep the job. The boss refused to allow it. The result was war. If Persico had been willing to yield authority, the family would have thrived. But pride prevented that. And in the end, nobody won. Not the Persicos, not Arena, not the soldiers who died. The only winner was law enforcement, which watched a major crime family destroy itself from the inside.
August 1983, Queens, New York. An FBI agent sat in a surveillance van listening to a conversation happening inside a house. The agent heard something that would eventually cost the man his life. Angelo Ruggiero, a mobster connected to John Gotti, was discussing heroin deals on his kitchen phone. He didn't know the FBI was listening. More importantly, he didn't know that his boss, Paul Castellano, would soon find out. And when Castellano learned about the drug dealing, he promised death. That promise would spark a chain of events that would destroy the Gambino family's leadership and change organized crime in New York forever. The rule: one cardinal edict. Paul Castellano became the boss of the Gambino family in 1976. He inherited a rule from his predecessor, Carlo Gambino. The rule was simple and absolute. Nobody deals drugs. Not one member of the Gambino family could get involved in narcotics trafficking, not under any circumstances. If you were caught dealing drugs, you didn't become a made man, you got killed. Castellano enforced this rule strictly. He had people murdered for breaking it. A man named Angelo Melli was a Gambino member who dealt drugs in Brooklyn. When he got arrested and went to prison, Castellano ordered his death the moment Melli got released. That was the message: break the drug rule and you die. The question everyone asked was, why? Why was Castellano so rigid about this one thing? The answer was simple. Federal prosecutions for drugs carried massive prison sentences, 20 years, 30 years, life sometimes. If a guy got arrested for drugs, Castellano believed he might flip on his boss to reduce his sentence. So it was safer to just prohibit drugs completely. But there was a problem with this rule. By the 1980s, drugs were the most profitable business in organized crime. Heroin generated more money than gambling, more than loan sharking, more than stealing, more than any traditional mob enterprise. Young mobsters saw that money and got frustrated. Why should they make thousands running street rackets when they could make hundreds of thousands dealing drugs? And the more frustrated they got, the more they started doing it anyway, secretly, behind their boss's back. The tension: 2 generations, 1 family. John Gotti was a mid-level capo in the Gambino family in 1983. He was 43 years old, a street guy, the type of mobster who made his money through violence and intimidation, not business deals. His mentor was the underboss, Aniello Della Croce. He was the old guard, the man who reported directly to Castellano, but also represented the street soldiers who wanted action and money. Della Croce understood something Castellano didn't. The younger generation of mobsters wanted to make serious money. So Della Croce quietly allowed drug dealing within his faction, the Street Crow, Gotti's Crow.
It wasn't official, it wasn't approved, but it was tolerated. Castellano had built a wall between himself and the street. He lived in a mansion on Staten Island, far from the neighborhoods where his soldiers operated. He gave orders, but didn't understand street-level realities. Gotti, by contrast, was in the streets every day. He understood what young mobsters wanted. He also understood what he could make if he controlled the drug trade. By 1983, Gotti and his crew were making serious money dealing heroin. But they were doing it quietly, carefully, never in front of Castellano, until Angelo Ruggiero got sloppy. The mistake, the phone call. Angelo Ruggiero was Gotti's close friend. Ruggiero had a brother named Salvatore who died in a plane crash. After Salvatore's death, Ruggiero and his brother, Gene Gotti, decided to deal drugs to settle Salvatore's estate and take care of loose ends. They involved themselves in serious heroin trafficking, but Ruggiero wasn't careful about it. In 1983, the FBI got a warrant to bug Ruggiero's house. They planted a listening device in his kitchen. Ruggiero started talking about drugs on a phone he thought was secure. He talked to his wife, he talked to his associates, he discussed amounts, prices, delivery schedules. All of it went directly into the FBI's recording devices. The conversations were clear, detailed, incriminating. In August 1983, the FBI arrested Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti for dealing heroin, based entirely on the wiretap recordings. Castellano heard about the arrests immediately, and he was furious.
Castellano called Ruggiero. He wanted the wiretap transcripts. Ruggiero refused to give them to him. It was a power play. Ruggiero was saying, "I answer to Della Croce, not to you." Castellano interpreted this refusal as insubordination. But more importantly, Castellano saw what was in the transcripts. Evidence that Gotti's entire crew was involved in massive drug dealing. The question in Castellano's mind was simple. Was Gotti operating this independently, or was he part of the conspiracy? According to multiple sources, Castellano started planning to have both Ruggiero and Gotti killed. He felt threatened by them. They had violated his cardinal rule. They had challenged his authority by refusing to give him the transcripts. And Castellano hinted that he planned to break up Gotti's crew entirely. The fear when Della Croce dies. In December 1985, Agnello Della Croce died of cancer. Della Croce had been the buffer between Castellano and Gotti's crew. Della Croce protected them. Della Croce covered for them. Della Croce made sure Castellano didn't find out how much drug dealing was happening. With Della Croce gone, that protection disappeared. Castellano immediately appointed Thomas Bellotti as the new underboss. Bellotti was a Castellano loyalist, a yes man, not a protector of the street crews. Gotti understood what this meant. He was now exposed. Without Della Croce, Castellano could move against him. And according to informants, Castellano was planning to do exactly that. The boss was going to either demote Gotti or have him killed. Gotti had to make a decision. Wait around and hope Castellano changed his mind, or move first. The decision, the point of no return. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti were having dinner at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. A hit team was waiting outside, 4 men in long coats and Russian fur hats. John Gotti sat in a car across the street with Sammy Gravano, using a walkie-talkie to communicate with the hit team. As Castellano and Bellotti stepped out of their limousine, the hit team opened fire. Castellano took 2 bullets, then another, then another. He fell to the pavement, dead. Bellotti was also killed. In less than 30 seconds,
the leadership of the Gambino family had been decapitated, and it was all because Castellano had banned drug dealing. If Castellano had allowed controlled drug operations, Gotti and his crew would never have had a conflict with him. If Castellano had been more connected to the street, he might have seen the uprising coming. If Castellano had been less isolated, living on Staten Island in his mansion, maybe he could have negotiated with the younger generation. But he didn't, and he died for it. The aftermath, the power shift. Within 2 weeks of Castellano's death, John Gotti was elected as the new boss of the Gambino family. The street crew had taken over. The business-focused faction, represented by Castellano, was gone. And one of the first things Gotti did as the new boss was reverse Castellano's drug ban. Gotti allowed his crew to deal drugs openly. Within months, the Gambino family was making more money than ever before. Gotti himself was making an estimated $10 million to $12 million per year. His crew was making millions in heroin and cocaine trafficking. The very thing Castellano had forbidden became the foundation of Gotti's power.
The irony, what Castellano was right about. Here's what's interesting about this story. Castellano's fear about drug dealing leading to government prosecution was actually justified. In 1990, the FBI arrested Gotti and Sammy Gravano based partially on evidence related to narcotics operations. Gravano, Gotti's underboss, eventually became an informant partly because of disputes over drug dealing. The apartment bug that ultimately convicted Gotti discussed drug operations and murders committed to protect those operations. So Castellano's original instinct was correct. Drug dealing leads to federal prosecution and cooperation deals. But Gotti didn't care. He gambled that he could run a drug empire, stay in power, and avoid prosecution. He was wrong. But for nearly a decade, he was right. He ruled New York. He made more money than any mob boss in history. He just eventually got caught. The cost. What Gotti's drug empire really cost. When Gotti legalized drug dealing in the Gambino family, he created wealth. But he also created something else. Addicted communities. Harlem, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens. These neighborhoods were flooded with heroin and cocaine under Gotti's watch. Addiction rates skyrocketed. Overdose deaths increased. Families were destroyed. The wealth that Gotti made came directly from the suffering of poor communities in New York. This is the part of the mob story that never gets romanticized. The money came from somewhere, and that somewhere was neighborhoods where people were losing their children to addiction. The bigger picture, the clash of two eras. Paul Castellano represented an older generation of mob bosses. They understood that sustainable organized crime required discipline, rules, organization. You didn't break the rules. You didn't show off. You didn't draw attention. John Gotti represented a new generation. He cared about rules less and money more. He showed off, he courted media attention, and he flaunted his wealth. The conflict between Castellano and Gotti was really a conflict between two different philosophies about how organized crime should work. Castellano thought it should be a business, quiet, professional, long-term focused. John Gotti thought it should be about power, visible, domineering, personal. In the short term, Gotti won. He took over, he made more money, he became famous. But in the long term, Castellano was right. His flashiness and his decision to allow large-scale drug trafficking made him easier to investigate and prosecute. By 1992, Gotti was in prison for life. By contrast, Castellano, if he hadn't been murdered, might have lived to old age in his mansion, never spending a day in federal prison. The question: was Castellano right to ban drugs? From a business perspective, probably yes. Drug trafficking generated enormous heat from law enforcement.
federal agents focused on narcotics investigations. The penalties were severe. Long-term, a crime family based on extortion, labor racketeering, and gambling operations would probably have been more sustainable than one based on drug distribution. But from a human perspective, the drug ban was just a way of deciding which crimes were acceptable and which weren't. The Gambino family committed murders. They committed extortion. They committed loan sharking. They committed labor trafficking. The question wasn't whether they committed crimes. The question was which crimes they committed. Castellano chose to draw the line at drugs. Gotti chose to allow drugs as long as they were profitable. Neither choice was moral. One was just about profit margins and prison sentences. The legacy. Why this matters. The conflict between Castellano and Gotti had consequences that rippled through New York organized crime for decades. After Gotti took over, the Gambino family became more violent and more involved in narcotics trafficking. This attracted more federal attention. More prosecutions followed. By the time Gotti died in prison in 2002, the Gambino family had been devastated by federal convictions. Castellano's philosophy of keeping the family disciplined and conservative might have allowed the family to survive and operate for longer. But we'll never know, because Gotti moved first, and Castellano died in front of a restaurant.
The final lesson: pride before the fall. Paul Castellano's downfall came from his isolation. He lived on Staten Island. He didn't associate with street soldiers. He didn't understand their frustrations. He issued an absolute rule about drug dealing without understanding that this rule was unsustainable given market conditions. He thought his authority was sufficient to enforce the rule through fear. But fear only works if people believe you'll follow through. And Gotti didn't believe Castellano would actually kill him. Gotti believed he could manipulate Della Croce and Castellano's other advisors into protecting him. When Castellano proved willing to move against Gotti anyway, it was too late. Castellano's pride in his authority, his isolation from the streets, and his underestimation of Gotti's willingness to commit murder all combined to create his downfall. He was a powerful man, but power without wisdom is just a target.
Thanksgiving weekend, 1989, Manhattan, Little Italy. A 72-year-old widow named Nettie Sorelli was on vacation in Florida. Her apartment on the third floor of a building at 247 Mulberry Street sat empty. While she was gone, FBI agents broke into her home. They planted a listening device, a single microphone hidden inside the apartment walls. For the next 13 months, that microphone would record 600 hours of conversations. And those recordings would destroy organized crime in New York. The setting: the most powerful mob headquarters in America. 247 Mulberry Street sat in the heart of Little Italy in New York City. Downstairs was the Ravenite Social Club, a legitimate-looking community gathering place. Wood paneling, red leather chairs, a coffee machine, nothing suspicious. But for decades, it had been the actual command center of organized crime in New York. Lucky Luciano had used it. Carlo Gambino had used it. By 1985, John Gotti had made it his base of operations. The Ravenite was where the mob's most important business got discussed. Territory disputes, contract murders, money laundering operations, who gets killed and why, everything. The untouchable Don, John Gotti, before the fall. John Gotti had done something that seemed impossible. He killed his boss, Paul Castellano, in broad daylight in front of a restaurant in Manhattan in 1985. No permission from the commission, no approval from other families, just a bullet to the back of Castellano's head and a bullet to his driver. The mob world expected immediate retaliation. The other families had rules. You don't just murder a boss without getting permission first. But Gotti was so popular with the rank-and-file members that nobody challenged him. Within weeks, Gotti had taken over the Gambino family. Within months, he had consolidated power completely. By 1987, John Gotti was the most powerful mob boss in America, the leader of New York's most important crime family, the man others went to for decisions. The media called him the Teflon Don because nothing seemed to stick to him legally. He'd been arrested multiple times, but never convicted of anything serious. The FBI, meanwhile, was obsessed with taking him down. The problem: how do you bug a mob boss? The FBI's Gambino squad, led by Bruce Mau, understood something that would become crucial to everything that followed. To prosecute John Gotti, they needed him on tape, talking about crimes, discussing murders, planning illegal activities. But Gotti was careful, too careful. In 1988, they tried bugging the Ravenite Social Club directly. They got inside, they planted microphones, they waited for recordings. Nothing. The problem was simple. The Ravenite was noisy. An espresso machine hissed constantly, a soda machine rattled, multiple conversations happening simultaneously. The FBI used audio filters, they moved the microphone around, they tried everything. All they got was garbage recordings. They could hear voices, but they couldn't make out what was being said. Audio clarity was terrible. Meanwhile, Gotti was getting smarter. He realized people could see him inside the Ravenite from the street. He started requiring his capos to meet with him inside the club every Wednesday night to show loyalty and respect. The regular weekly meetings meant the FBI could photograph and identify mob members. But for the most sensitive conversations, Gotti disappeared. Nobody could follow him. FBI agents watched him walk into the Ravenite, then hours later he'd walk out from a different exit. The agents couldn't figure out where he was going.
The breakthrough: finding the apartment. The FBI had an informant inside the mob, someone feeding them information. The informant reported something crucial. Gotti sometimes left the Ravenite through a back door. He'd walk into an adjacent hallway inside the building. Then he'd go upstairs to an apartment somewhere in the building. FBI agents started investigating the building's residents. They discovered a woman named Nettie Sorelli, a 72-year-old widow. Her late husband, Michael Sorelli, had been a soldier in the Gambino family. He died years earlier, but the apartment was still being used. And Gotti had been using it for his most sensitive meetings. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, apartment 10. The FBI realized what was happening. Gotti would leave the Ravenite when he needed to discuss real heavy stuff: the murders, the money, the business that needed protection. He'd go upstairs to Nettie Sorelli's apartment, where he couldn't be heard from the street. Only a handful of people knew about this practice: his underboss, his consigliera, his most trusted captains. It was his secret vault. The plan: breaking into the widow's home. Over Thanksgiving weekend 1989, the FBI found out that Nettie Sorelli would be vacationing in Florida. The apartment would be empty. Bruce Mau and the FBI made a decision. They would break in, plant a bug, see what Gotti discussed when he thought nobody was listening. They had the legal authority to do it. A federal judge had signed off on an electronic surveillance warrant. The FBI had probable cause that crimes were being discussed in that apartment. On the Friday of Thanksgiving weekend, while Nettie Sorelli was enjoying the beach in Florida, FBI agents broke into her apartment. They had schematics of the building. They knew the layout. They planted a sophisticated listening device inside the apartment walls. Then they left, making sure nothing looked disturbed. Nettie Sorelli came back from vacation, never knowing the FBI had been inside her home. She went about her life, going to church, visiting neighbors, having dinner. All the while, the FBI was listening to every single conversation that happened above her head.
The danger when Gravano heard himself.
The second part of this story involves Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. Gravano was Gotti's underboss, his right-hand man, the guy everyone thought was loyal to Gotti completely. But in December 1990, after Gotti was arrested, something happened that changed everything. The FBI played portions of the apartment tapes to the prosecution. When Gotti heard that the tapes existed and that they had been used against him, he made a critical mistake. He told Gravano they couldn't listen to the tapes, that listening to them would give Gravano ideas, that Gravano should just trust him. Gotti forbade Gravano from hearing what was on the tapes. This terrified Gravano. If Gotti was saying, "Don't listen to the tapes," that could only mean one thing. Gotti had said something negative about Gravano on those recordings. Gotti was probably laying groundwork to have Gravano murdered, making it seem justified to the other capos. Gravano got paranoid. He got scared. When the FBI approached Gravano and offered to let him listen to a portion of the tapes, Gravano said yes immediately. They played him a recording of Gotti making bitter, insulting comments about him, disparaging remarks, comments that showed Gotti was setting up Gravano's murder. That was the moment Gravano decided to cooperate. He agreed to become a witness, to testify against Gotti, to tell the government everything he knew about the Gambino family. The betrayal, when the underboss turns witness. Sammy the Bull Gravano was a killer, a legitimate hitman for the mob. FBI investigators estimate he was involved in 19 murders, maybe more. Gravano himself later admitted to 19. He had made a lot of people money through violence and intimidation, but when he realized Gotti was planning to have him killed, he made a choice. He flipped. He agreed to testify in open court about organized crime, about the structure, about the murders, about Gotti's leadership. This was almost unheard of at the time. An underboss of a major crime family testifying against his boss was shocking. Nobody did that. Nobody. It violated every code organized crime had. But Gravano did it anyway. In return, the government agreed to a deal, a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony. Gravano knew this meant he could never go back. His entire mob family was finished with him. Every organized crime family in America would view him as a traitor. But it was better than being murdered by Gotti. The trial, when Gotti's own words convicted him. In 1992, John Gotti went to trial for racketeering, murder, illegal gambling, and numerous other crimes. The prosecution played portions of the apartment tapes in open court. Jurors heard John Gotti in his own voice, on tape, ordering murders. They heard him discussing his criminal enterprises. They heard him talking about paying off police and judges. They heard him explaining the structure of the Gambino family. The tapes were devastating. Gravano testified about the murders discussed in those tapes. He provided specific details, context, background. Gotti's own defense was that Gravano was a liar, a cooperator trying to save himself. But then the tapes played, and Gravano's testimony matched the tapes exactly. The jury didn't have any doubt. In April 1992, after just days of deliberation, they returned a guilty verdict on all counts. John Gotti was convicted of 5 murders, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, obstruction of justice, tax evasion, illegal gambling, and extortion. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gotti's criminal career was over.
The ripple effect. The dominoes fall. Once Gravano flipped and Gotti was convicted, the entire structure of organized crime in New York began to collapse. The mobsters who had been loyal to Gotti saw what happened. They saw that their boss was going to die in prison, that loyalty to Gotti meant nothing. More people started cooperating with the government. More capos testified against their bosses. More soldiers became informants. The domino effect was devastating. By the mid-1990s, most of the major New York mob leaders had either been convicted or were in the process of being convicted. Paul Castellano was dead, murdered by Gotti.
John Gotti was imprisoned for life. The underbosses were either dead, in prison, or becoming witnesses. The Colombo family was in chaos from internal war. The Genovese family had lost several bosses to federal prosecutions. The Lucchese family was fractured. The Bonanno family was weakened. All of it traced back to one decision: planting a bug in Nettie Sorelli's apartment over Thanksgiving weekend, 1989. The mistake. Why Gotti lost. The question everyone asks is simple. Why didn't Gotti realize he was being bugged? The answer reveals something about Gotti's biggest flaw: arrogance. Gotti believed he was smarter than the FBI. He believed he was untouchable. He knew the apartment was being used by previous mob bosses for sensitive conversations, but he never thought the FBI would go to the effort of breaking into a widow's apartment. He never thought the FBI would have the patience to plant the bug and wait. He thought his security measures were good enough, that using an apartment instead of the social club was sufficient protection. He didn't account for the FBI's persistence, what illegal authority, or their ability to get access to buildings. Gravano later said that Gotti's decision to require everyone to meet at the Raven Night every Wednesday was stupid. It was a vanity move. It let the FBI photograph everyone. But when Gravano warned them, Gotti insisted. He needed to see his capos. He needed them to show respect by showing up. His arrogance killed them. The building. What happened to 247 Mulberry Street? After Gotti's conviction and imprisonment, the FBI moved against the building. In 1997, federal marshals seized 247 Mulberry Street. They filed papers claiming the building was the property of organized crime. Under a legal theory called civil forfeiture, the government can seize property if it's used for criminal purposes. The building was forfeited to the government. It was auctioned off. A new owner took over. Today, 247 Mulberry Street is a shoe store on the ground floor. The old Raven Night social club is gone. The apartments above are still apartments, but they're no longer mob headquarters. The building that once was the nerve center of organized crime in New York is now just another piece of real estate in Little Italy. The legacy. How one bug changed everything. The bug in Nettie Sorelli's apartment became the template for how the government fought organized crime going forward. Wiretaps and bugs became standard tools. The FBI invested heavily in electronic surveillance training. They figured out how to plant bugs in almost any location. They realized that a single conversation could provide more evidence than years of investigation. The lesson was clear. Organized crime bosses could be brought down by their own words. Within a decade after Gotti's conviction, most of the major mob bosses in America were either in prison or dead. The FBI had learned how to systematically dismantle organized crime using electronic surveillance. By the early 2000s, the traditional American Mafia was essentially finished as a major criminal force. It didn't happen because the FBI was tougher. It happened because the FBI was smarter. They learned to listen instead of just watch. They learned that patience paid off. They learned that sometimes the best evidence comes from the target's own mouth.
The irony, what happened to the key players? John Gotti died in prison in 2002 of throat cancer. He was 61 years old. He spent the last decade of his life in a maximum security federal prison. Sick, weak, isolated. Sammy the Bull Gravano testified against multiple mob bosses. He received a reduced sentence and was eventually released. He violated parole multiple times and went back to prison, but he survived. Frank Lacasio, Gotti's consigliere, was also convicted based on the apartment tapes. He received a life sentence. Bruce Mao, the FBI agent who led the investigation, became a legend in law enforcement. He was the key to everything. And Nettie Sorelli?
The 72-year-old widow whose apartment was secretly bugged? She went about her life never fully understanding what had happened in a home above her head. She was never informed that the FBI had used her apartment to record one of the most important prosecutions in organized crime history. She was never given a choice about whether her home could be used for this purpose. It was done, and it worked. The question, was it worth it? There's a legitimate debate about whether the FBI was justified in secretly breaking into Nettie Sorelli's apartment without her knowledge or consent. Yes, they had a legal warrant. The judge approved it. The law allowed it. But ethically, is it right to use someone's home for electronic surveillance without their knowledge? Nettie Sorelli was an innocent widow. She wasn't involved in organized crime. She wasn't part of the conspiracy. Yet her apartment became ground zero to destroying the mob. On one hand, it worked. It resulted in convictions of dangerous criminals. On the other hand, it required violating an innocent person's privacy. The government made a choice. An innocent woman's privacy was less important than bringing down organized crime. Most people would probably agree that it was the right choice. The results speak for themselves. But it's worth noting what was given up to achieve those results. The real story, what the media missed. For years after Gotti's conviction, the media focused on Sammy the Bull Gravano's testimony. They made it seem like Gravano was the hero of the story, the rat who took down the boss. But the truth is different. Without the bug in Nettie Sorelli's apartment, Gravano's testimony would have been just his word against Gotti's word. It would have been a he said, she said situation in a federal courtroom. The jury might not have believed Gravano. But with the tapes playing Gotti's own voice, ordering murders, and discussing crimes, suddenly Gravano's testimony had corroboration. The tapes proved Gravano was telling the truth. The tapes made Gotti's conviction inevitable. So the real story isn't about Gravano flipping, it's about the FBI listening. It's about patience, persistence, and a single listening device planted in a widow's apartment over Thanksgiving weekend. The final lesson, when organization beats force. The Italian mob had been built on the idea of strength and loyalty. You were loyal to your boss, you didn't talk, you didn't cooperate with the government. You were tough, you were violent, you were feared. But organized crime in America learned the hard lesson in the 1990s. Strength doesn't matter if you're talking. Loyalty doesn't matter if someone's listening. Fear doesn't matter if your own words convict you. John Gotti had every advantage. He had thousands of soldiers. He had police on his payroll. He had judges with connections. He had money, power, respect. But he lost to an FBI agent planting a microphone in an apartment. He lost because he thought he was smarter than the system. He lost because his arrogance made him careless. He lost because he didn't understand that in the modern world, electronic surveillance could beat even the most powerful criminal empire.
South Boston, 1970s. The streets were controlled by a man everyone feared. He was known as Whitey, an Irish mobster who ruled through violence, who killed rivals, who extorted money from bookmakers, loan sharks, and drug dealers. People who refused to pay him got beaten. Some got murdered. Everyone understood the rules. Then, in 1988, a newspaper revealed something that would shatter Whitey Bulger's entire world. He wasn't just the mob boss. He was an FBI informant. And worse, the FBI had been helping him commit crimes the entire time. The beginning, from streets to Alcatraz. James Whitey Bulger was born September 3rd, 1929 in Boston. He grew up in the Old Harbor Housing Project in South Boston, an Irish neighborhood, working class, tough. Bulger was the oldest of 6 children. His father was a dock worker. His mother was a housewife. By age 14, Bulger was already in trouble with the law. By his 20s, he was committing armed robbery. In 1956, he was arrested for armed robbery and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. He served time in multiple prisons, Leavenworth, Lewisburg, and most famously, Alcatraz. While in Alcatraz, Bulger participated in something that would haunt him for life: CIA LSD experiments. The CIA was testing the effects of the drug LSD on prisoners to see if it could be used for mind control. Bulger was one of the subjects. He was given LSD without his full knowledge of what was happening. The experience was traumatic and disorienting. Bulger was released from prison in 1965 after serving 9 years. He returned to Boston and went to work as a bookmaker and loan shark. The rise, taking over Boston. In the early 1970s, Bulger was an enforcer for the mob, a muscle guy, someone who collected debts through intimidation and violence. His specialty was extortion. He would approach businessmen and demand rent to operate in Whitey's territory. Pay the rent and you could run your business safely. Don't pay and Whitey would destroy you. By 1979, the boss of the Winter Hill Gang, a man named Howie Winter, was sent to prison for fixing horse races. Bulger and his associate Stephen Flemmi stepped into the power vacuum. Bulger became the new boss of the Winter Hill Gang. From that point forward, he controlled Boston's underworld, the gambling operations, the loan sharking, the drug dealing, the extortion. He became one of the most powerful mobsters in America, and nobody could touch him. The secret, the FBI deal. What made Bulger untouchable wasn't just fear. It was something much more powerful. It was the FBI. In 1975, Bulger agreed to become an FBI informant. His recruiter was an FBI agent named John Connolly. Connolly and Bulger had grown up in the same neighborhood. They had known each other as kids. Connolly idolized Bulger's older brother, William, who would eventually become a powerful Massachusetts state senator. When Connolly became an FBI agent, he had one goal: take down the Italian Mafia families that operated in Boston, specifically the Patriarca crime family from Rhode Island. Connolly went to Bulger and made a deal. Bulger would provide information about the Patriarca family. In return, the FBI would protect Bulger and his Winter Hill Gang from prosecution. Bulger agreed. On paper, it sounded reasonable. The FBI uses informants all the time. They get information in exchange for protective treatment. But what happened with Bulger went far beyond that.
The corruption, when the FBI became the criminal. Instead of investigating Bulger, the FBI protected him from investigations by other law enforcement agencies. When the DEA started investigating the Winter Hill Gang for drug trafficking, the FBI tipped Bulger off. When Boston police started looking at Bulger's operations, the FBI blocked the investigation. More shockingly, FBI supervisor John Morris accepted bribes from Bulger. Morris received $7,000 in cash. Connolly accepted bribes as well. He received a 2-carat diamond ring. Bulger also purchased plane tickets for Morris's girlfriend so she could visit him. The FBI supervisors knew about this corruption. They knew about it and did nothing. Why? Because Connolly and Morris were successfully using Bulger to gather information on the Patriarca family. And that was more important to their careers than the rule of law. The power, using the badge for crime. With FBI protection,
Bulger became essentially immune to law enforcement. He systematized extortion across Boston. Every bookmaker, every loan shark, every drug dealer had to pay Whitey tribute. If they refused, Bulger would have him beaten, or worse. In 1980, a man named Brian Halloran worked for Bulger. Halloran got arrested and decided to cooperate with the FBI. Halloran went to Connolly and said he wanted to turn informant. He offered to testify against Bulger and Flemmi for multiple murders. Connolly did something shocking. Instead of rearresting Bulger based on Halloran's evidence, Connolly called Bulger and told him that one of his men was about to testify against him. He gave Bulger a heads up. Then Bulger had Halloran murdered. Halloran was shot in a parking lot at a waterfront bar multiple times, executed. The FBI agent had essentially ordered the murder by tipping Bulger off. The system, building an empire with FBI help. With FBI protection, Bulger built a criminal empire. He controlled drug distribution across Boston, cocaine, heroin, everything. He operated gambling operations, bookmaking rings, loan sharking businesses. He extorted money from legitimate businesses. All the while, the FBI knew about it. All the while, the FBI protected him. During the 1970s and 1980s, Bulger and Flemmi operated with complete impunity. They murdered rivals. They threatened witnesses. They extorted entire industries. And the FBI did nothing. In fact, the FBI did worse than nothing. The FBI actively protected Bulger while he committed these crimes. The exposure, 1988. In 1988, something happened that changed everything. Journalists at the Boston Globe, working as part of their Spotlight team, began investigating police corruption and FBI corruption in Boston. The reporters, led by journalist Gerard O'Neill, discovered something shocking. The FBI had been protecting Whitey Bulger the entire time. Bulger had been an FBI informant since 1975. The reporters also discovered the corrupt relationship between Bulger and FBI agent Connolly. They discovered the bribes. They discovered how Bulger had been tipped off before arrests. They discovered that the FBI had essentially been running a protection racket for a mobster. The Globe published a series of articles detailing everything. The story went public. Boston exploded. How could the FBI allow this? How could a major law enforcement agency protect a known criminal? An internal FBI investigation was launched. Congress began asking questions. The public demanded answers.
The investigation, when everything unraveled. The FBI Inspector General's office began a major investigation. Agents interviewed witnesses. They reviewed FBI files. They examined the relationship between Connolly, Morris, and Bulger. What they found was the worst corruption scandal in FBI history. John Connolly was arrested. He was convicted of racketeering, obstruction of justice, and murder. He received a 40-year sentence. John Morris, the FBI supervisor, was also indicted. He pleaded guilty to corruption charges. The FBI eventually admitted that Bulger had been an informant and that the agency had provided him protection for his crimes. But by then, it was too late. The escape, 16 years on the run. In 1994, Bulger learned through his FBI connections that federal prosecutors were about to indict him for multiple murders. Connolly, even though he was facing prison himself, tipped Bulger off one last time. Bulger fled. He went on the run for 16 years. The FBI placed Bulger on their 10 most wanted list. At one point, he was the second most wanted person in America. Only Osama bin Laden was higher on the list. $1 million reward was offered for information leading to his capture. But Bulger had vanished. He lived under assumed names. He used fake identities. He hid in plain sight. He eventually ended up in Santa Monica, California, living at a rent-controlled apartment blocks from the Pacific Ocean. He lived with his longtime girlfriend, Catherine Gregg. They posed as a retired couple, an old man and woman living quietly near the beach. Nobody suspected that one of America's most wanted criminals was living there. The capture, June 11, 2011. In June 2011, an FBI tipster called the agency with information. A man matching Bulger's description was living in Santa Monica, apartment 303 at the Princess Eugenia apartment complex. FBI agents moved quickly. They confirmed the sighting. They lured Bulger to the basement garage of the apartment by telling him there was a problem with his storage locker. Bulger walked into the garage and found himself surrounded by FBI agents. He was arrested without a fight. After 16 years on the run, Whitey Bulger was finally captured. He was 81 years old. The trial, facing justice. In 2013, Bulger went to trial in federal court. He was charged with racketeering, extortion, conspiracy, and multiple murders, 19 counts of murder specifically. The prosecution presented evidence of his crimes. They brought witnesses. They presented documents. Bulger maintained his innocence. He denied being an informant. He claimed the FBI was lying about their relationship. "I never snitched. Never, never," Bulger said at trial. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
The death, final justice. On October 30, 2018, Bulger was transferred to a federal prison in Hazleton, West Virginia. Less than 12 hours after arriving, he was found beaten to death in his cell. He was 89 years old. The prison made a statement. Bulger had been killed by fellow inmates. Who did it? A Mafia hitman serving a life sentence was believed to be involved. The hitman allegedly killed Bulger because Bulger was a rat, an informant, someone who had betrayed the code of organized crime. The irony was perfect. Bulger had spent his entire life denying he was an informant. He had maintained his criminal code. He had insisted he never snitched. But the truth was undeniable. He had been an FBI informant. He had cooperated with law enforcement, and he died in prison for it. The scandal, the worst FBI corruption case. The Whitey Bulger case became the most notorious corruption scandal in FBI history. Congressional hearings were held. Reforms were implemented. The FBI changed its policies on how informants were handled. New safeguards were put in place to prevent agents from being corrupted. New oversight mechanisms were created. But the damage was done. Dozens of criminals were released from prison because evidence against them had been tainted by the Bulger scandal. Innocent people suffered because the FBI had been too focused on taking down one crime family to notice they were enabling another. The question, why did the FBI allow it? The answer is depressingly simple: bureaucracy and ambition. FBI agents Connolly and Morris were judged based on their success in taking down the Patriarca family. Using Bulger as an informant helped them get convictions against that family. So they protected Bulger. They broke the law to help a criminal because it helped them advance their careers and their agency's agenda. It's a corruption that starts at the top. The supervisors knew. The administration knew. They tolerated it because it produced results. And when it was exposed, they claimed ignorance. The lesson is that even government agencies can become corrupted. Even the FBI can lose sight of its mission. When an institution prioritizes one goal over all others, people get hurt. The legacy? A man who beat the system. Whitey Bulger lived nearly 90 years. He murdered people. He extorted thousands. He ran drug operations. For most of his life, he faced no consequences. He beat the system by corrupting the people who were supposed to stop him. He lived freely while good cops and prosecutors worked to take him down.
He became rich and powerful while innocent people suffered. He only ended up in prison after 16 years on the run and after the entire scandal was exposed. And even then, he died in prison in a way that many believe was justice served outside the legal system.
February 3rd, 1971. Williamsburg, Brooklyn, 778 Driggs Avenue. A drug bust was about to go down. Frank Serpico, an NYPD detective, knocked on a drug dealer's apartment door. He expected his two fellow officers to follow him inside. They didn't. Instead, the door cracked open slightly, then slammed shut. A shot rang out. The bullet entered Frank Serpico's face just below his left eye. It severed an auditory nerve. It lodged fragments in his brain. Frank Serpico fell to the ground, bleeding, and his fellow officers didn't call for help. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't an accident. This was the NYPD trying to silence the only honest cop in New York City. The system, how corruption worked. When Frank Serpico joined the NYPD in 1959, he believed he was joining an institution dedicated to justice. He was 23 years old, an idealist, a son of immigrants who believed in working hard and serving his country. What he found instead was an organization built on a foundation of bribes. The corruption wasn't hidden, it wasn't criminal, it was systematic. Officers on the beat had a job: collect money from illegal gamblers, drug dealers, prostitutes, and business owners running unlicensed operations. The officers would show up, they would demand cash, hundreds of dollars sometimes. In return, they would look the other way. They wouldn't make arrests. They wouldn't shut down the operations. The money would go into a pool. The pool would be divided among the officers. It was called taking the pad, and nearly every cop in Brooklyn took it. The scale, millions in payoffs. The Knapp Commission, which eventually investigated NYPD corruption, found something stunning. The payoffs amounted to millions of dollars annually. Not from one precinct, from the entire police force. Officers were categorized by their corruption. Grass eaters accepted small gratuities, a free meal, a small bribe, things they passively received for looking the other way. Meat eaters actively shook down drug dealers, pimps, and gamblers for hundreds of dollars at a time. The meat eaters were making the real money. Some officers were making the equivalent of a second full salary just from taking bribes, and nearly every officer participated in some form of it. The few who didn't were viewed as threats. The problem: the honest cop. Frank Serpico refused to take bribes. In a department where nearly everyone was on the take, Serpico was an outlier. His partners would collect their share of the payoffs. They'd expect Serpico to take his cut. Serpico refused. At first, his partner made a deal. He would take Serpico's share so Serpico could feel like he wasn't participating. This arrangement worked for a while. Serpico could be part of the unit without actually taking bribes. But eventually, other officers started asking questions. Why wasn't Serpico taking a share? Was he saving it all for himself? Was he going to be a problem? The suspicions grew. The tension increased. By the late 1960s, Frank Serpico had become a marked man in his own department. An honest cop in a corrupt system is more dangerous than a criminal, because an honest cop can't be controlled. Internal channels. In 1967, Serpico reported evidence of systematic corruption to his superiors. He documented specific instances, specific amounts, specific officers. He expected the department to investigate. Instead, nothing happened. No investigation, no arrests, no discipline. The report simply disappeared. Serpico realized something terrifying. The corruption went all the way to the top. The supervisors know, the commanders know, the brass know.
and they were protecting it. The decision: go in public. For years, Serpico stayed quiet. He did his job, he refused the bribes, he kept his mouth shut. But by 1970, he couldn't stay silent anymore. He reached out to a journalist named David Burnham at the New York Times. Burnham was an investigative reporter. He understood how institutions worked. He understood power. Serpico told him everything: the payoffs, the amounts, the system, the fact that supervisors knew and did nothing. Burnham listened. He believed him. Most importantly, he documented it. On April 25, 1970, the New York Times published a front-page story based on Serpico's testimony and Burnham's investigation. The headline was devastating: widespread police corruption in the NYPD. The story detailed everything: the amount of money, the way the system operated, the fact that it was systematic, not isolated. The story went national. Newspapers across the country picked it up. Congress took notice. The mayor took notice. Mayor John V. Lindsay had to respond. He appointed a special commission to investigate police corruption. The commission was named after its chairman, Whitman Knapp. It became known as the Knapp Commission. The exposure, the Knapp hearings. The Knapp Commission held public hearings. They called witnesses, they took testimony, they listened to evidence. Frank Serpico testified on camera, in public, in front of the entire city. He described what he had witnessed: the corruption, the system, the way officers preyed on poor communities. Other officers testified too. Some, like Sergeant David Dirk, supported Serpico's account. The Knapp Commission compiled its findings. The Knapp report was shocking. The commission concluded that corruption was not isolated. It was systemic. It existed at all levels of the NYPD. At least 40 police officers were indicted in the months that followed. Corrupt officers were arrested, charged, some were convicted. The exposure was complete. The problem: Serpico was still in the department.
But there was one problem. Frank Serpico was still an active NYPD detective, and the department now knew exactly who had exposed him. Serpico had destroyed careers. He had gotten cops arrested. He had humiliated the entire department on the front page of the New York Times. The NYPD didn't forgive. Serpico was now the most hated man in the police department. Worse, he was still working on the streets, on the beat with other officers who wanted him dead. The setup: February 3rd, 1971. On February 3rd, 1971, Serpico was assigned to a drug bust in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. 2 fellow officers accompanied him. According to Serpico's account, which was later corroborated by investigators, what happened next was either a tragic accident or an attempted murder. Serpico knocked on a drug dealer's door. He told the other 2 officers he was going to knock and would need them to follow him into the apartment. The door cracked open slightly. Serpico briefly turned around to gesture to the other officers to get ready. But they weren't there. They weren't following him. He was alone. The door slammed shut. The dealer saw his opportunity. A shot rang out. The bullet hit him in the face. He fell backward, bleeding. When backup officers arrived, they found Serpico wounded and alone. The 2 officers who were supposed to back him up had vanished. They claimed they didn't hear the shot. They claimed they didn't know Serpico had been hit. Their story didn't add up. Multiple witnesses confirmed they had heard the gunshot clearly. The 2 officers had simply left Serpico there to die. The aftermath: alone and bleeding, Serpico was rushed to the hospital.
The bullet had entered just below his left eye. It had severed an auditory nerve. It had lodged fragments in his brain. Doctors said he was lucky to be alive. He was also now permanently deaf in one ear. He would deal with pain and neurological issues for the rest of his life. While Serpico recovered in the hospital, the NYPD's official story was that it was a tragic accident during a routine drug bust. But Serpico knew different. He believed his fellow officers had set him up, that they had deliberately left him alone to be shot, that this was their punishment for testifying against the department. Was it true? Investigators have never determined for certain. But Serpico wasn't the only person who believed it. Other honest officers believed it. Internal affairs investigators believed it. The public believed it. The NYPD had sent a message: if you expose us, we will kill you. The recognition, too little, too late. After being shot in the face, Frank Serpico was awarded the Medal of Honor. It was the NYPD's highest award for bravery in action. But the ceremony was deliberately humiliating. There was no public ceremony, no acknowledgement, no recognition. Serpico was simply called into an office. A superior handed him the medal. No words, no handshake. They handed the medal to me like an afterthought, like tossing me a pack of cigarettes, Serpico later recalled. There was no certificate, no paperwork, no official record of the award. It was as if the department was acknowledging him while simultaneously insulting him. The message was clear. We're giving you this medal because the whole world is watching. But we don't respect you, we don't honor you, we're doing this against our will.
The exile, leaving America. After testifying before the Knapp Commission, Serpico couldn't stay in New York. The hatred from his fellow officers was palpable. The threats were real. He was a pariah in his own department. So Serpico made a decision. He retired from the NYPD on June 15, 1972. Then he left the country. He spent the next decade living abroad, in Europe, traveling, recovering from his injuries, processing the trauma. He lived in the Netherlands, in Switzerland. He tried to escape the memory of what happened to him. Eventually, after nearly a decade, he returned to the United States. He settled in upstate New York, away from the city, away from the NYPD, away from the corruption he had exposed. The Hollywood version, Al Pacino and Serpico. In 1973, 2 years after being shot, a movie came out about Frank Serpico's life. It was called Serpico and starred Al Pacino. The film became a classic. It won multiple awards. It brought Serpico's story to millions of people. But the movie changed the story. In the film, Serpico is a heroic loner who bravely stands up to corruption and wins. The reality was much darker. The real Serpico didn't win. He got shot in the face. He lost his hearing. He lived in exile. He spent the rest of his life haunted by what happened. The movie made it seem romantic, inspiring, a victory, a good over evil. The reality was that good got shot in the face and had to flee the country. The ongoing hatred, decades later. Even decades after retiring, Serpico faced ongoing hatred from the police. When his friend and ally, Sergeant David Dirk, died in 2012, Serpico heard something shocking. Police officers posted messages on a police website regretting that Serpico had not died instead. 50 years after exposing corruption, the NYPD still hated Frank Serpico. That's how deep the betrayal cut. That's how permanent the damage was. The real investigation, was it a setup? Over 50 years after the shooting, Frank Serpico wanted answers. He hired an attorney. He filed requests for reinvestigation. He wanted to know, was the shooting an accident or was it an intentional setup to kill him?
The NYPD has never officially investigated the possibility. The shooting was closed as a routine incident. The suspect was identified and convicted of attempted murder. But the question remains, were Serpico's partners supposed to follow him into that apartment? If they had, Serpico probably would not have been shot. Were they deliberately absent? Or was it coincidence? Serpico believes it was deliberate. He believes it was coordinated. He believes his fellow officers set him up to be murdered. We may never know for certain. The legacy, the Serpico effect. Despite everything that happened to him, Frank Serpico's actions changed the NYPD. The Knapp Commission's recommendations led to reforms. New policies were implemented. Oversight mechanisms were created. Accountability systems were established. The Serpico effect became a term in law enforcement for increased accountability and transparency. Honest officers were finally protected instead of persecuted. The culture began to shift, though slowly and incompletely.
The most important part is the accent. The final truth, the cost of integrity. Frank Serpico paid an enormous price for doing the right thing. He was shot in the face. He lost his hearing. He lived in exile. He was permanently traumatized. His fellow officers hated him. His department humiliated him. His reward was a medal handed to him like garbage. And it took 50 years for the NYPD to officially issue him a proper certificate for that medal. In 2022, at age 68, Serpico finally received a ceremony, a proper recognition, a formal acknowledgement of what he had done. But by then, he had spent 50 years with the question unanswered. Why did my own department try to kill me? The question, was it worth it? That's the question Serpico has had to live with. He exposed corruption. He changed the system. He helped create accountability in law enforcement. But he paid with his health, his career, his peace of mind. He spent decades wondering if his fellow officers had deliberately set him up to be shot. Was it worth it? Serpico has said yes. He says that exposing corruption was the right thing to do, regardless of the personal cost. But that's easy to say when you're talking about justice and integrity. It's much harder when you spend 50 years with bullet fragments in your brain and permanent hearing loss.